This is a podcast from ABC Radio Overnights. I'm Rod Quinn. These days, it's nearly impossible to look a week ahead, let alone a month or a year. COVID has turned our world upside down. Things we once took for granted are now things of the past. So can we look to the future and make an accurate guess about what our lives and our world will be like even 10 years in the future? And what should we be thinking about? 2 years ago, did anyone predict our predicament? But this morning on our Talking Point, we're going to try. We're going to look into the future, not in a far-flung science fiction sort of way, but we're going to be a bit more concrete and confine our speculations to the near future, specifically what the world will be like in 2030. And if you think that's a way off, it's closer than 2010. Surely there are some things, potentially already in development, that we can say will happen with some degree of certainty in a decade's time. What sort of technology will we be using? What sort of jobs will no longer exist, and how will travel have changed? Will you have been into space in 10 years' time, perhaps? These are some of the issues we'll be discussing with our guest, futurist Lucy Green. She has spent over a decade forecasting for Fortune 500 companies and was profiled as a leading global futurist in the Trend Forecaster's Handbook. Lucy's first book, Silicon States, The Power and Politics of Big Tech and What It Means for Our Future, was also released 3 years ago. But from the United States, Lucy Green is with us. Lucy, good morning.
Hi everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can indeed, and I appreciate your time. It's very valuable, and I appreciate the fact that you've given that time to us today. Let's start with the past, the recent past. 2 years ago, did anyone predict that the world would be brought to its knees by a virus?
Not so much a virus, although when you look at previous pandemics, I guess we were due one. Although what's interesting, if you look at subsequent reporting, various aspects of it could have been anticipated by the pandemic is directly linked, according to some experts, to reduced biodiversity and climate change. So that has been a sort of a key driver. So I guess some people might have anticipated that this would happen, but certainly not the timing of it and the magnitude.
So in that case, is it in any way possible to predict the future? How can we do it when even 2 years ago, 18 months ago, we didn't know that we'd be in this predicament? How can we look, or how does someone look 10 years into the future?
That's a really good question. I mean, I like to think of it as futures on several different tiers. So, an anomalous phenomenon, that's a tongue twister, maybe you couldn't anticipate. But what's interesting is that the pandemic has actually accelerated a lot of shifts that were already happening. So, for example, what we've talked about is, I guess, the crisis of connection, the fact that we're living such digital lives and app-driven lives, and the reduction of our sense of community and empathy. This was really rising as an idea before the pandemic and has only been more magnified during this time. And lo and behold, you see more and more brands trying to create a sense of community and more of a regard for the role of the state and helping other people. You see, innovation in tech, for example, and immersive tech experiences. So before the pandemic, people were shopping on, for e-commerce, obviously, and participating in digital events, but that has only been exponentially increased. So there's key things that just really have actually it's almost made it go faster. But to your point about the future and predicting trends, that there are, of course, huge variables. I would say one of the biggest variables, if you're thinking about the next 10 years, is the degree to which big tech is regulated. When you think about some of the biggest forces on culture and the way we live right now, it is dominated by the dominance, quite literally, of social media companies. I mean, I'm in New York, and I've been watching the trial, the sort of statements of the police who defended the Capitol in the insurrection. Also, a lot of coverage about objections to the vaccine and questioning of the vaccine. And I would put that a lot down to the dominance of social media in our news cycle. The other huge variable, of course, is we think about the next 10 years is climate change, or climate crisis, some would say, which could have massive and unpredictable impacts on the way we live. But alongside that, you have things that will only continue to grow, like the fact that because we're living longer, that people and consumers, let's say, are spending more and more on well-being and fitness and health, trying to fortify themselves against the world around them, which may or may not be toxic or whatever, but also thinking about the way that they might be living and working until much later on in their life. And right. I see that as a consumer trend, which will only continue to become more sophisticated and important and central.
I want to go back to something you mentioned a moment ago, that is almost the app-driven economy. And I don't know that when the smartphone was introduced that first time, and there were apps on it, but we couldn't possibly, or maybe people did possibly imagine what change, I might say, it would do, that the apps on your phone would in some ways destroy the taxi industry with the development of things like Uber, forever change the restaurant industry, and now with apps on your TV or on tablets, destroying, the movie industry. It's changed the music industry as well. There are these unforeseen things, or were they foreseen? And what will be the gadget, if we can look ahead, in the next 10 years that's going to change the world the way that the smartphone did?
Right. I would say that actually the role of the smartphone might become even more important and central. I think with the advent of augmented reality en masse and location data, and the importance of messaging, from not just messaging between people, families and so on, but between brands, and using messaging to pay for things, I would say actually the role of the smartphone could become ever more consolidated, especially when we're out of the home. Within the home, the role of technology is actually changing, but not becoming less important. I think what's interesting is we fetishized technology for a long time, and we needed tech to look like tech. And the latest wave of technologies that we will see embedded into the home will become sort of almost invisible. So much more sensorially operated, if that makes sense. So voice operated, verbal recognition, visual recognition. We don't need it to look, it doesn't need to have a screen, or it could have a screen that appears but then disappears. We'll want the tech to disappear from being obviously integrated into our environment, but it will become ever more cognitive and aware of our habits and anticipatory and so on, and connected more directly to commerce. So, I mean, you see this with the explosion of the use of devices like Peloton, but also Amazon Alexa and all those smart speakers, and also that's sort of shifting towards mirrors. So you're almost seeing the home emerge as a sort of form of hardware and service baked in, but without the visible aspect of technology being so knocking you over the head.
You know, I'm also thinking about, with COVID, the uses of QR codes and those sorts of things for contact tracing would have been impossible without those apps.
Absolutely. But although it's interesting, I think so exactly, and that puts more of a focus on mobile phones again, and a mobile phone data collection on and cross-referencing data sets in new ways. You know, it's interesting when you look at a retailer like Farfetch, for example, who are looking to combine, which has not been done before, the way we behave online and what we search for online with how we've interacted with a store, maybe how long we've spent looking at a shirt or whatever. And I think with these QR codes, you're going to see more and more hyper granular analysis and awareness of our habits as our online behavior gets connected to where we've gone for a coffee, where, beyond checking in on Instagram and saying, I've had this cappuccino and taken a photo of it, which may concern a lot of people, which may be concerning.
Zoe has texted in 0467 922 702. The gadget, she says, or the thing that we'll be looking at most in the next decade is the 3D printer. What about the 3D printer? We already have them. I mean, they're all over the place at the moment, but they're not overwhelming. They're not in everybody's home. They're not in everybody's pocket. What about the 3D printer when it comes to all sorts of things, whether it be, printing replacement parts for bodies or replacement parts for things that break down? What about the role of the 3D printer? How important will that be by 2030?
That's a really interesting idea. I mean, it's one of those things, it's a bit like virtual reality, where there sort of seems to be, in the context of like the history of trend excitement, let's say, bursts of excitement about it. And what's interesting is when I would compare it with virtual reality actually, in the sense that we've not quite found the right application for it yet. Yeah. Because it's incredibly isolating, and we found that like any technology device that isolates us from our outside world actually has limited consumer take-up as something that we might use every single day. We don't want to sit in our living room and use virtual reality because it isolates us from our peers and from the world around us. However, it's incredibly effective. They're finding new applications of it, for example, for treating PTSD with therapy, because it's a very immersive form of therapy. And so when it comes to a 3D printer, I think what's interesting is you are seeing this increased metabolism of awareness among consumers about everything from brand behavior to sustainability. And I think at first there was tremendous excitement about the fact that you could 3D print something. But then, of course, the idea of everyone having a 3D printer in their home quickly moved on to conversations about sustainability and were you actually creating anything of note. But now I think the most interesting applications of that are for, and I think you touched on this a little bit, like medical applications potentially, or last mile destinations, let's say, where you can't create your hearing aid in a very distant region or whatever. Yes. But will 3D printers become the same as having like a smart speaker in your home? I really don't think so. Okay. But the applications of it to transcend like geographic divides could be really interesting.
Now, Mick has texted. He says there are some predictions that the cost of producing renewable energy will reduce substantially, resulting in at least a few decades of abundant, cheap energy. So one of the things, that's a great point that Mick makes, that one of the things that we're often thinking about is how the planet will be better off if we do use renewables rather than, oil-based or, fossil fuels and that sort of thing. But surely there's another thing is, well, hang on, does that mean that more people are going to be travelling? Does it mean that with cheap energy, people will be doing things that are currently being held back because of the expense of energy?
Yeah, I mean, my knowledge of the subject is more that, like, I think those could be helpful in doing less damage rather than proactive, like creating massive abundance. Unless what some of these moonshots, for example, a lot of this discussion around space, aside from Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson going off into orbit and the excitement around that and space tourism, but one of the, I guess, industry opportunities in space exploration is the potential to mine asteroids for fuel and potentially also dump some of our excess, the landfills out into space. But I can't see, for me right now, I feel like the future of sustainability is being regenerative, rewilding, and actually being more mindful about our consumption. I think there's a cultural shift away from disposable waste of consumer products, of flying 10 times a week, as I don't fly 10 times a week, but I flew several times a week. Right. I would say that, especially in the last year, that the idea of disposable resources has fundamentally shifted to something where we want to be more mindful and more efficient and find innovations to make ourselves operate better in a more cleaner way.
Lucy Green is our guest. As we look into the future, you talked about big tech and the regulation of big tech. Now, when TV and radio to a lesser extent came in, they were pretty heavily regulated with, you're only allowed a certain amount of TV stations, for example, or you had to have both sides of a political argument, have to have equal time. You couldn't have more than a couple in each market, as it were. That's just totally gone out the window, and that was heavily regulated. Big tech really hasn't been regulated at all. How do you think that we'll get the genie back in the bottle when it comes to the regulation of big tech?
Well, it's really hard because it's not even like these companies are regional. They sort of transcend the idea of government because they're global, and their tax bases are sort of also transcendent, seemingly. And so I think it's going to be really, really hard. And I think it's also to do with the evolution of legislation that has not kept up with the pace of technology. So, yes, I completely think that big tech, especially social media companies, should be regulated and have more responsibility in terms of false information, the limitations of their, how much influence they have from from a monopoly point of view, and so on. But I also agree that they are not a pure version of a media company. So it's like, how do you create regulations for something that is both a community, it's user-generated content, but there is also media being sort of consumed as media. I think it's a new thing, and we need innovation in legislation to find the right controls for these groups and for new business models that are emerging every single day.
You reckon, or you've said, that women are more vulnerable to the consequences of big tech. Why do you think that is? What's the case there?
Well, so, for example, women are much more subjected to online abuse, for example. And that is also, there are scant or relatively scant. So there's a few different aspects to this. So there's the fact that women are disproportionately subjected to online attacks and bullying. In fact, the UN described Twitter as toxic and used the phrase, which I think is very telling, digital violence. So this idea that can be as corrosive as physical violence and the threats to women. Women are very underrepresented in also the execution and development of products. So, for example, it was very telling that Apple was famously delayed to introduce menstrual tracking into its health package because simply no one had sort of suggested that be a product feature. You have at every sort of level of the production and execution of these products, you have a lack of the female voice, right. And then famously, just women's experience in these companies is not fantastic, or there's been a lot of high profile cases.
Well, that's why Bill Gates has stepped down. At least that's what we are told. Lucy Green is our guest. We'll talk about the future of work. George wants to discuss that. George, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Lucy. And yes, I'm worried about big tech affecting the future of work. Apart from all the other problems it's going to cause. I just wanted to ask Lucy, because this is something I've been thinking about for a long, long time. We keep getting told by our governments that, and I mean, there's been reports, quite significant and well-researched reports about how many jobs, something up to maybe 40%, possibly more of existing jobs will be lost in the next decade and a half even. We're told that new jobs will spring up, that people will then be able to switch from the old jobs that have been displaced to new ones. But most of these jobs seem to be in high-tech areas that require a lot of IT qualifications or other high-tech skills, which I don't think our population, because it is just a bell curve population with people who are quite intelligent and capable of doing certain things, and other people maybe who are more suitable to labouring and more, manual occupations. That's fair enough. But those occupations will increasingly be, taken over by machines. I mean, even courier drivers will probably be replaced by drones the way it's going. So I just wonder if Lucy had any idea where this would end up in terms of where the new jobs might come from.
All right, George, thank you very much. I mean, we've seen all this before. We saw it with the Industrial Revolution. We saw it with the introduction of the motor vehicle. with every technological step forward, jobs change. There aren't that many blacksmiths around. That's what people say. But, I mean, is George right? Are we looking at, a major upheaval now because of this, and that there will be simply vast unemployment because there aren't the jobs?
I don't think there'll be vast unemployment, but I do think that the World Economic Forum has talked about this, about how the skill sets for the future are empathy, collaboration, but importantly, adaptability and critical thinking. So it's not focused on a vertical. And I would say technological skills keep on becoming automated and commodified. So I would almost not want to focus on a tech skill. But we are moving away from this idea, I think, of a singular career. We're moving towards a portfolio idea of careers. I mean, I'm 40 years old, and I have already worked in media and seen media collapse, and then worked in ad agencies and seen, to some degree, the traditional idea of the agency very much disrupted. I've now lived through a pandemic to see the world order and maybe the airline industry massively disrupted. So I think what's going to evolve is a picture of where there is industry, people do spend money, people still live and spend on products, but the notion of what a product is and what they are consuming will evolve, and that will require jobs and the way you think of what you do for work to evolve. Already you're seeing sort of innovations such as micro-certification, and that's very much in the tech side of things, but also business, So education moving away from having a degree, and that's just it, that's all you do, and then you do whatever career you have for life. Now, I think we're going to move to a picture of constant education and certification to learn new skills and adapt to new ways of working. So that's one thing, and also thinking, I think, and you're seeing this happen already to an extent, again by necessity during the pandemic. But I think it's an idea that will continue. Of like, where did we get the 5-day work week from? Do we really need that? And a lot of 5-day work weeks predicated on needing to afford to live in cities, and those two things being very interconnected. Now that we don't necessarily need to live in a city, do we need to work 5 days a week? Do we need to have a career trajectory? Can you design your life in different ways, and instead of going for a higher salary, radically reduce your living costs, for example? I think a lot of that stuff is now up in the air, and technology has, in a positive way, allowed us to have more flexibility to design the way we work and live. So I think that's going to be really interesting going forward. And one of the more interesting components of that is the connection between work and the city for me. I've been thinking a lot about this as I lived in New York City through the whole pandemic, and there was a huge exodus, and the cost, it wasn't surprising to me because the cost of living had become so crazy, and salaries had to be so crazy to match the crazy cost of living and be competitive. And then people left. And it got me to thinking about like cities as the center of work, and whether that will continue. Because even though workers are starting to come back to offices, it's not going to be on any level that there was before, and it will be much more flexible. So what is the role of the city going forward? Like, will we, historically cities have been devised around this idea of exchange of physical goods, of connection to waterways and transport, of institutions, like connection to educational institutions, to universities, to art centres, and so on. And again, it also had this like diversity of thought and diversity of groups. And I would say that cities have actually become very homogenous and very rich and not inclusive. And meanwhile, trade of goods has become completely digital and decentralized. Education has arguably now, especially after the pandemic, become digital, or digital is expanding really quickly. And then even when you think about trends and creativity and culture, like do trends and creativity and culture necessarily come from cities? I actually don't know. And increasingly, I think that work and the way we live will become more human, but also as in like more affordable, but become more decentralized now. We'll see the rise of more like micro communities.
So what about something that Andrew Yang was very big on in the election last year, the US presidential election, and that Maria is texting in about as well, and that is about the universal basic income or universal basic wage, that everybody is paid something, whether they're working or not, and that's just one way that the government makes sure that everybody is looked after.
Right, and there's that becomes a public health issue, right? Like if people are below a poverty line for a certain amount of time, it creates a very unstable society. And I think also there's an argument for universal basic income that, by splitting up benefits and making it sort of somewhat competitive or gamified or lots of different loopholes, that it sort of doesn't achieve the actual goal. I mean, I look at countries like Denmark and Sweden where it's not quite universal basic income, but there's a version of that in the sense that the philosophy supposedly, and I'm waiting for someone to email me in and email and say that I'm drastically wrong. But Northern European economies get painted as sort of hyper-socialist and that is anti-entrepreneurialism and so on. But actually, my understanding of the philosophy is that they take away the sort of basic dividers in society. Like, we'll take away the basics like education, health and so on, and therefore allow you to flourish. And I think it creates somewhat of an even playing field for people to worry less about certain things. And then you compare it with an economy like the US, where yes, salaries are higher, but there's a myriad of hidden costs that stop social mobility here, from tipping to health insurance costs.
Well, one of those things, can I ask, and Marnie has texted in about this as well, what about property prices? They only seem to go up. That's just part of the deal. And people, young people in particular, cannot afford to buy a house. Are we looking now at a change that maybe part of the Western world and people, in countries like Australia, will have to live like they do in America, where generally people don't own where they live? Not everywhere. In the cities, they certainly don't. They rent for their entire life. Is that what we're looking at? I
mean, this is a subject near and dear to my heart, as someone who lives in Manhattan, where it's actually quite impossible, especially if you are a single person, to buy. And I think this is where there really is a need for, and I think a lot of it is tied up in Western economies with private forces, with taxation. I mean, certainly the UK is famously like a sort of a tax haven for this, and you're seeing a similar thing happen in New York, where you have Hudson Yards, which is all investment properties, or a lot of it is investment properties, and they're designed to be empty, and therefore you have these sort of empty communities. I think going forward, there really is an opportunity for innovation in financial products. Certainly, you have millennials really, is the perception of millennials, who are the largest adult and working age population right now, is that they're hugely entitled and they can't afford to buy property because they're buying avocado toast and taking selfies and whatever. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. You have millennials, if millennials have got independent and inherited wealth, they actually have been able to buy, and therefore they're sitting on assets that are going to continue because of these forces towards property is sacrosanct. They're only going to go up. And then you have the other end of millennials, again, this the biggest adult generation today, who are still not able to buy property. And so, and then there either needs to be legislative change and more innovation on that front, or I think there needs to be more financial products that enable millennials to buy assets. I mean, I think the pandemic has proven, you've seen, I think, the impact of a lot of precarious employment models come unended in the last year, from 0 hours contracts to self-employment. I think similar thing is or a revelation needs to occur with the ability of millennials or just people generally to have social mobility, but also acquire assets. And it has become very, very polarised.
Okay, let's turn our attention with Lucy Green to international politics. Owen, good morning.
Good morning, Rod and Lucy. My question has to do with two aspects fascinating me over the coming decade or so. The first is the rise of authoritarian regimes. You see, a lot of the major superpowers like China and India, but also places like Turkey and Hungary, and you had authoritarian regimes that are increasingly hostile to democracy and political freedoms. And then conversely, and I'm not just talking about the persecution of the Uyghurs in China and the Muslims in India and so on, but even in places like the United States, there's a good case to be made that minority rights are being eroded. For example, state legislatures across the United States are enacting laws that predominantly discriminate against minorities, and the Supreme Court has been gradually eroding provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which makes me curious. Where does Lucy think in the future? Does she think that we're going to actually go backwards in both areas of authoritarianism and minority rights?
All right, good question, Owen. Thank you very much for that. So, what's the future for democracy, not only in the West, but beyond the West as well, and even within countries like the US, less so perhaps in Australia, but the future of minority rights? What are we looking at there, Lucy?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. You have, for example, and I think social media, I hate to keep on coming back to big tech, but I think social media is having this very distorting impact on politics and our understanding of news, of the other. And then I think also the on-demand culture, from dating apps to Uber to so on. Like, we used to have this real connection to the common cause. You used to have to go to a doctor's surgery, a train station, and interact with people from other walks of life and think more on a communal level. And I think between smartphones, on-demand culture, and social media, we've really stopped being able to not only empathize, but think of the collective whole. And I think that's only, unless something changes, that might become ever more prevalent. So I think that's really interesting. And then when you think about the role of government, I have a more hopeful take on that, or like, this is my last hope. I think what's interesting, what you see happening now, is that you still see the political scene in most countries dominated by boomers, baby boomers, and by a certain generation. Like, I think there's some statistic about the US where the majority of government is disproportionately, in terms of the makeup of the population, of a certain generation. Boomers are older than that. And what is exciting to me is that you are going to see in the next decade the first, not only digitally savvy, and I wouldn't say that all people, I don't want to come across and say that like 50-year-old, my mom is the most digitally savvy person ever and sends me emojis, but someone who understands the framework of these companies and how they work. And you're seeing that in the US happen with Lina Khan coming in, for example, to Biden's government to start to regulate potentially tech companies. So a tech literate generation who have an understanding of the sort of more insidious forces within these companies in terms of their impact on society, but also a generation that have not been represented in government before, who are, especially when you look at Gen Z, who are teenagers for anyone else. And I'm sorry, I've been in New York too long. Gen Z for anyone who's in the UK. Thank you very much.
I didn't want to correct you, but I was stunned to hear it coming out of someone with an English accent.
Oh, don't. I even order tomatoes when I go to cafes. I've been here for 8 years. I'm sorry. But it's in part to translate myself for people here. But
yes.
But I think seeing a new generation for whom climate change is not a debate, right? Coming into government and being a lot more activist about like what, I think a lot of Gen Zs are hugely angry about the world that they've inherited and are already very politically active. And active is the word. Like, I would say the only thing about millennials, although the last year has been a wake-up call, or the last couple of years, let's say, is that millennials were sort of historically quite passive when it came to politics, and that really translated into voter turnout. So I do think that the political picture will start to change as these two generations become more engaged and active in politics as politicians, but also as a voter base. You saw that in the UK, like the vote for Leave versus Remain, disproportionately younger people wanted to remain part of Europe.
Yes.
And so I think the next 10 years we'll see them become more prevalent in politics, and therefore we might see a shift in policy.
Well, here's another text from someone who, perhaps not surprisingly, didn't sign their name, but they make a point that I think is, well, I'll get you to comment. Here's a prediction. Men are to blame for absolutely everything wrong with the world, right through to climate change, so will need to be punitively restricted full-time, white, straight men in particular. Now, I understand the point that our texter is trying to make. However, isn't the real point here is that, yes, white, straight men, or white men certainly, we don't know if they're straight or gay, have ruled the world for the last, 1,000 years or so. Now we're looking at a time where more and more people, diverse backgrounds, are getting their say. Is that a bad? Cannot be a bad thing. But there seems to be a lot of resentment from straight white men that their time perhaps is over.
Yeah, I mean, this is stealing a summation of this from someone more clever than me, who I actually can't remember who they are. But it feels like sharing feels like oppression.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
And I think it's unfortunate that word woke has become so weaponized, because at its core, what it started out as meaning in American culture certainly was paying attention to politics. And generally, I think progressivism is started out about being respectful and mindful of other people and thinking about equality. And I think all of those ideas most people could get on board with. However, I think we've really accelerated to this atmosphere where woke is sort of, it's weaponized. And I equally think with cancel culture, it's become very much focused on semantics and language with not much room for learning and intention. And that's not to disregard that, like, even if you're learning, your words have impact, of course. But we've sort of, it's become very polarized and binary. And really what it boils down to, or the point to me of sort of like equality and intersectional equality, so everyone from class to gender to race having a shot at social progression, like that to me can only be a good thing, but it's being distorted into something that and politicized into something that is sort of much different than what that right. constitutes. And I also think it's distorted the reality. Like the point is, I mean, yes, you have this outsized cultural noise about the patriarchy, let's say, and only this week in the UK, JWT, my former employer, has been in the news, and where two former executives successfully sued for, male white executives sued for sexual discrimination, because the agency had tried to rebuke a very infamous survey that found that a huge gender pay gap. And the head of the agency and the creative head of the agency had talked about trying to increase more diversity and move the agency into the future, and they took that, and that has resulted in this this verdict that the two men have successfully sued for sexual discrimination, subsequently being made redundant, which they connect to that. I would recommend, I'm not an expert on any of that, and I'm not legally connected in any way, so I would recommend everyone just go and read about that, because okay. I hope I haven't misrepresented those That's details. Right. But what was interesting in the interviews, and I will get to a point, is so there's a lot of cultural discourse throughout this, but it actually bears like not much connection to actual reality. The fact is that white men still earn more, disproportionately get more leadership jobs, that advertising, major industries are still huge, including big tech, are hugely lacking in diversity. And so the idea that this is actually directly impacting men is I think, not true.
Just have to look at world leadership to see that white men still run the world. But Campbell in Newcastle says, I had to smile at the suggestion that if billionaires wanted to explore new territories and go where they've never been before, just walk them down to the tax office. Do you think that's going to change? In fact, do you think that with younger people being more outraged about this sort of thing, that maybe we've only got a couple of minutes left, that perhaps there will be a greater attempt to make people pay what they should?
I think they will, and I think the tipping point has been Bezos actually going into space, and that very
yes, thanking the buyers and the workers for being able to shoot him into space. If they had their choice, he wouldn't come back.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's been there's rising sort of momentum and behind the idea that these companies should be taxed, and also you've got a very critical, engaged online audience who know that companies just simply launching a headquarters in a city is not necessarily good for the city, especially if they're getting a huge tax break. So I think we see these things much more holistically. From Amazon's headquarters, the bidding war that it put in place. I also think there's just been a lot more emphasis, and it's because of the pandemic and like frontline workers and so on the role of the worker and the rights of workers and labour, and as it connects to social mobility and a fair society. And so I think there will be mounting, it varies by economy and culture, of course. Like in Central Europe, it's very normal to crack down on huge companies and regulate and tax. Whereas in the US, it becomes very radicalized, right? It becomes framed as socialism. But I think even in an economy like the US and a culture like the US, there is a rising, very much widely accepted idea that these companies have just got too big and that they are not contributing to society and therefore should be. And also, I think this idea, there's been a rhetoric, and I talk about this a lot in my book, that the government can't innovate and the government is too slow and we need private individuals to take us to space. Well, guess what? NASA is funding and has funded a lot of what Elon Musk is doing. NASA got us to space much sooner, and the government actually invests in a huge amount of innovation, and the private sector then commoditizes it. But like, it's this idea, I think almost the government needs a PR makeover and more credit for what it does, and so I think there'll be more effort to give more credit to government and like meaningful innovation. Like, we don't need to go to space, we've got major problems here. Let's put all that energy and that moonshot ambition towards equality and the environment. Like, we don't need to send a teenager into space.
Yes, to see the problems from up there, and to paraphrase a great man from the 1960s, you may leave here for, half an hour in space, 5 minutes in space, but when you return, it's the same old place, unfortunately. Lucy, I would love to talk again with you. I'd love to talk more with you as well. Thank you so much for your time today, and I really do hope we get the chance to talk again. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
That is Lucy Green. Her book, by the way, is Silicon States, The Power and Politics of Big Tech and What It Means for Our Future. Came out a couple of years ago. Track that one down, and what a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate that very, very much.
Overnights with Rod Quinn
on ABC Radio.